Chris, thanks very much. Good evening, everybody. Nice to see you all here on a warm summer's evening. For those of you who have heard some of my talks before, I have something called Artillery 101. And that particular talk was basically the foundation of an artillery battery. What do you need to make an artillery battery in the Civil War? You need organizational and men, you need the guns, you need the ammunition, and you need the horses. So this is a trial run on something I call Artillery 201. So this is postgraduate stuff, okay? We're moving up in the world. So we're going to talk tonight about how the United States Army organized the artillery force during the first 3 years of the Civil War. And we're going to focus on two primary individuals, Henry Hunt and William Berry. They were the two leaders that got the artillery program on board or off the road. So we'll start with a little history before this. So at the beginning of the Civil War, there were 4 U.S. artillery regiments, just like there were 10 U.S. infantry regiments and 5 U.S. cavalry regiments. So at the beginning of the Civil War, the 4 artillery regiments really had been around for 40 years. They were, when the Army reorganized in 1821, they established 4 artillery regiments, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. They didn't put cannons in every battery. They had 9 batteries per regiment. That would be 36 batteries. But horses cost a lot of money. And feeding horses costs a lot of money. So only 4 regular artillery light companies were authorized. But they didn't even fund those guys for another 17 years until September of 1838, when the first company, Company C, the 3rd Artillery, was authorized to be mounted with horses at Carlisle Barracks. And the captain was Captain Samuel Ringgold, who's actually from this area in an earlier stage. And when the company was organized and given horses and guns, they needed some lieutenants. So a young fellow who just come out of West Point, his name was Lieutenant William Berry, was assigned to Ringgold's company. And William Berry is the officer that really organizes the American artillery at the beginning of the Civil War. It wasn't for almost another year where the other 3 regiments finally got their horses and guns. 1st, 2nd, and 4th companies were equipped as field artillery. So, 10 years later, Mexican War. The Mexican War happens, and a lot of the leaders of the Civil War are artillery officers. And they are artillery officers that actually fought as artillery. Much of the U.S. artillery establishment in the Mexican War still were considered what we call red leg infantry. So they didn't get guns, they didn't get horses. But this group of soldiers, many of them who you recognize, and many of them who you recognize from Antietam, fought in those artillery batteries. William French and Stonewall Jackson served together in Battery K. These 2 guys didn't get along very well, and they would have a problem about 10 years later, and when Jackson was driven out of the Army almost by William French. But French was a very good artillery officer. So was Jackson. In the 2nd Artillery in Light Company A, you had Henry Hunt and William Hayes. And Henry Hunt we all know pretty well as the organizer of the American artillery in the Army of the Potomac. But William Hayes actually fought in more artillery battles in the Mexican War than anybody else. From Palo Alto to the capture of Mexico City, William Hayes was an artilleryman. And it was only later in the Mexican War that Henry Hunt joins him and serves with him for the rest of the war. So they have a real close relationship. Unlike really French and Jackson, these 2 guys got along really well. The next interesting combination is Bragg and Thomas. Okay, Braxton Bragg, a very hard guy to live with, and George Thomas served in Company E, 3rd U.S. Artillery. Now we know that what happens 16, 17 years later is they are Army commanders on the opposing sides in the Western Theater. But in the Mexican War, they served together. The last 2 guys didn't serve together necessarily, but I wanted to demonstrate some guys from the 4th Artillery. One was Fitzjohn Porter, who commanded the 5th Corps at Antietam, and the other is Darius, if I'm saying it right, Darius Couch of the 4th Artillery, who had a division that arrives at Antietam the day after, isn't here in time. But both of those guys were heavily engaged in artillery as battery lieutenants in the Mexican War. So we move into the 1850s, and some of these guys who you saw on the other slide are now appearing and helping to develop the doctrine of the U.S. artillery. William Barry, Henry Hunt, and William French will co-author the red book there. It's actually the Fundamentals of Field Artillery. And the other book is written by John Gibbon. John Gibbon is an instructor at West Point. And so the artillerist manual is really for cadets. But between those two pieces of doctrine, you have what will emerge largely as how artillery is going to be fought on both sides during the Civil War. There's a lot of other books that will come out, but they all can harken back to these two books, I would say. So, the secession crisis, December 1860, South Carolina secedes from the Union. At that time, even though by now the United States government has authorized 4 more artillery batteries, so there should be 8, they've only got 7 mounted right now. Like I said, horses cost money. Feeding horses costs money. So there's only 7 artillery batteries in existence at the time of the Civil War, and you can see where they're located here. Farthest west is Battery C, 3rd U.S. Artillery. The 3rd U.S. Artillery tended to garrison the forts along the West Coast, California, Oregon, and Washington. So the whole regiment was out mostly on the West Coast, except for one company, which is in Fort Ridgely, Minnesota. That was Company E. You had Battery B, or Light Company B, 4th U.S. Artillery, probably the most famous artillery battery here at Antietam. At the beginning of the Civil War, they are at Camp Floyd, Utah, under Captain John Gibbon, who's just gotten out of West Point as an instructor, finished writing his book, and now he actually is commanding a light company. At Fort Leavenworth, you have 2 companies, Light Company I, 1st U.S., and Light Company A, 2nd U.S. Light Company I's command a guy, John Magruder, who will be known in the Civil War as Prince John Magruder. Very soon after Virginia secedes from the Union, he will resign from the U.S. Army. In Texas, we have 2 more. We have William French and Henry Hunt. William French and Henry Hunt collaborated on that manual a couple of years ago. Henry Hunt commands the only Napoleon battery in the U.S. Army in the beginning of the Civil War. A guy named George McClellan brought the design for Napoleon's from France when he traveled with a delegation earlier in the 1850s, and he saw the blueprints for the Napoleon, and he got permission to bring it back. So by the time the Civil War starts, we have 1 battery under arguably the foremost artillery authority in the U.S., and guess who's got it? Henry Hunt. So these batteries are going to make it to Bull Run. They're going to get there. Battery E from Minnesota, now commanded by Lieutenant Romney Ayres, who's an artillerist in the early days of the Civil War. Light Company I now, with Magruder resigning, is commanded by James Ricketts. We'll talk about it in a minute a little bit more. And Light Company A, which was Barry's company, is now commanded by John Tidball. If you're out on the battlefield at Antietam, you've been to the Tidball Trail. That's the one and only, that's the very same guy. Down in Texas, Hunt's battery manages to get to Washington as well before the fighting starts. The other companies will eventually make their way to Washington and be incorporated into the Army of the Potomac. A new battery will be organized at West Point. It's called the West Point Battery. It's taken from the horses and the guns, 4 guns and 6 horses per gun. We'll organize a 4-gun battery under a guy named Charles Griffin, who is an instructor of artillery and tactics at West Point. So all these batteries are now heading for Washington, D.C. at the beginning of the Civil War. A new artillery regiment is added. The 5th U.S. Artillery is authorized by President Lincoln in May of 1861. 12 additional batteries, because now we're starting to call them batteries. Before this, we called them light companies. But now this is the first time that artillery companies are officially known as batteries. And so they will all be organized and equipped with guns and horses. So they're going to come right out the gate. It's going to take a while to get it organized, but I thought it was informative if you look at those original 12 battery commanders, how many of them are killed in the first year of the Civil War. William Terrell is killed at Perryville out west, and the other three, Stephen Weed, John Smead, and Henry DeHart, are killed in the battles in the Eastern Theater here. So, okay, First Manassas, how not to use artillery, okay? How not to use artillery at First Manassas. And the problems are that the artillery at First Manassas is pretty much used incrementally. There is not enough, let me look at it. There's 12 batteries there, but only 5 of them are committed. So they don't commit all the artillery. And you know how artillery has to be successful is when you mass the guns, right? There's mixed calibers. So there's 10-pound Parrots, 6-pound guns, howitzers, all mixed up in these batteries. There's batteries subordinate to infantry, regimental, and brigade commanders. Now, I would submit, and if you've heard some of my other talks, an infantry regimental commander knows little about employing artillery. Okay, and so he can get them in a lot of trouble. So these guys have to report to these infantry commanders, and that doesn't work out well either. Ricketts, James Ricketts, who I introduced you to a second ago out there, who took over Light Company I, and Lieutenant Charles Griffin, who had the West Point battery, their batteries are captured. They're pushed out too far. They're employed like the artillery in the Mexican War. Why is that a different situation? Because in the Mexican War, we had smoothbore muskets. Now we got rifled muskets. And when you put those guns, those artillery pieces, in the same range that they were in Mexico, now you're getting horses and men killed by the enemy artillery. And they were so advanced that they lost 2 complete batteries. Ricketts is a prisoner of war until the following year. Griffin gets away, but they lose those 2 batteries. More artillery is lost in the retreat, and not enough artillery for the experience level of the troops. And I'll talk more about that in a second. The only shining star at First Bull Run is Henry Hunt. Henry Hunt's battery is one of the last to leave the field, and his battery and his guns prevent a bigger rout than might have happened if he hadn't been there. So Hunt stands out at First Manassas. So now we got to put somebody in charge of the artillery of the Army of the Potomac. Shortly after First Bull Run, George McClellan is appointed the chief of the Army, what will become the Army of the Potomac, and he will appoint William Berry as his chief of artillery. William Berry is New York City, born in New York City. He graduated from West Point in 1838. Remember, he was that young lieutenant in the very, very first light artillery company, flying artillery in the U.S. Army with Samuel Ringgold. He's going to be in Mexico, but he's not going to be actively engaged in one of the fighting units. He's going to be on a staff, and then he's going to get sick and he's going to have to come home. He's not going to stay there for the entire war. He's going to, with Henry Hunt and William French, write the artillery manual in 1856. And in 1858, the Secretary of War will make him commander of Light Company A, 2nd U.S. Those light companies were the only ones in the Army where you were not commissioned or appointed based on seniority. Okay? Everywhere else, the oldest guy standing, when the guy before him dies, takes over a company or a regiment. But because these companies are so specialized and so important, the Secretary of War picks the company commanders. So William Berry gets to be company commander of Light Company A, probably the most famous of the light companies in Mexico. He'll be appointed chief of artillery by McDowell, and in August he'll be promoted to brigadier general. This is what Henry Hunt says about Berry and the challenge that Berry has in getting everything organized. When Berry was appointed chief of artillery, the guns he required were lying as ore in the mines. Think about that. That the timber for gun carriages was still growing in the forests. That the hides from which the harnesses were to be made still covered the animals that furnished him. So what's he doing? He's starting from scratch, right? He's got to build this army establishment from scratch, okay? So Berry is going to submit some recommendations. And the first has to do with we want to get our hands on every regular Army artillery battery we can. Okay? Those are the guys that are already trained. Granted, they don't all have guns and horses, but this is the West Point trained artillery establishment in the United States Army at the start of the Civil War. So the boss writes a letter to the Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, and says, I really need those batteries. I would also urgently recommend that the whole of the regular Army, old and new, be at once ordered to report here. Well, McClellan wants them all. He's not going to get them all, but he's going to get a sizable chunk of those artillery batteries. And he's going to write that letter. And by the time the Army is ready to take the field in April of '62, the U.S. Army regular artillery is now 60 batteries. Remember, now we have 5 regiments of 12 companies each, 12 times 5, 60. All but 5 have gotten their guns and horses, okay? So if you look at this map, you can see that 35 of those are in Virginia with George McClellan. A big chunk of them are in Florida, guarding Fort Pickens. That's still a strategic stronghold we need to have. And the rest are kind of scattered around in other theaters. 4 are still in California at Alcatraz. They moved them all to Alcatraz Island. San Francisco is a critical location that needs to be held onto. So this is how the regular artillery looks at the beginning of the Civil War. By April of 1862, we have a sizable number of volunteer regiment artillery batteries, I should say. There's the 35 regular artillery batteries, and then you can see from the other states where they come from. And probably no surprise, 19 come from New York, biggest state in the Union. 12 come from Pennsylvania. But the smallest state of the Union, Rhode Island, has 6 artillery batteries. And Rhode Island will provide much of the leadership in the artillery commands throughout the war. They had the Providence Marine Corps Artillery, a militia outfit in Providence at the beginning of the war. And that's a seed bed for a lot of new artillery officers that are coming to the... This is the thing Brad Gottfried left last night. I'm going to put it over here. I'll drop it again. I may need it in a minute. So here's the composition right now of those batteries. Now Barry's going to come up with a bunch of recommendations about how to outfit the artillery in the Army of the Potomac. He believes that for every 1,000 men we need 3 guns. He thinks that as the experience level grows, we can scale that back to 2 guns per 1,000 or whatever. But he thinks, beginning of the war, all these guys are greenhorns. And so we need a relatively large artillery establishment. That means that if we had 100,000 men, how many guns do we want? 300 guns, give or take, okay? He believed that the guns should not be assigned to brigades or regiments. They should be assigned to divisions, infantry divisions, and nothing lower than that. He believed that 4 batteries per division was about right. He believed there should be 1 regular battery, U.S. artillery, for every infantry division. He believed that 6 batteries with uniform equipment, in other words, all Napoleons or all 10-pound Parrots or everything ought to be uniform. Don't mix them up. That's his recommendation. Well, let's see how that all works out. So by April of 1862, the actual ratio is about 3.3 guns. So he's achieved that. He has brought to the field, to the Army, literally hundreds of guns. We'll see some numbers in a couple minutes. We have now 13 infantry divisions in the force that's supposedly going to go to the peninsula very soon. We have 4 batteries per division in all but 1 of those infantry divisions. So we hit the mark there. We got 11 divisions that had a regular Army captain, okay? So we're moving along there. And we talked about uniformity, pretty much uniform. 57 of the 72 batteries are 6-gun, and most of them, 64 or 72, are uniformly equipped. So he's built the force that he needs to employ for the first campaign, which is the Peninsula Campaign of George McClellan in April of 1862. Okay, another recommendation is we don't want to have all different calibers of guns here. We don't want James guns and 6-pounders and 12-pound howitzers. We're going to standardize on 3 guns. We're going to standardize on, from bottom to top on the far right, the Napoleon, the model that George McClellan brought from France, that Henry Hunt has a battery of at the beginning of the Civil War. The best bronze smoothbore out there, I would maintain, okay? So we're going to standardize on the Napoleon for the smoothbores, and for the rifled guns, we're going to take two different kinds. We're going to take the 10-pound Parrott and the 3-inch ordnance rifle. Now those two guns fire nearly the same round. For the 10-pound Parrott, it's a 2.9-inch round, but later on they're going to uniformly standardize those and rebore them into 3-inch. The difference between them is that the 10-pound Parrott is cheap, inexpensive, and it's made of cast iron. And if you understand metallurgy, what do you know about cast iron? It can blow up on you, okay? So it's I won't say an inferior model because it serves very well, but it is inexpensive and it's not made as well as a 3-inch ordnance rifle. As you look at those, as you look at the trend here, what do you see? Those 10-pound Parrotts at the beginning, we got a lot of them, right? But by Antietam and by Gettysburg, we're trading those things in, aren't we? We're trading them in for 3-inch ordnance rifles, okay? So the Army has to get guns quick, and it's like you say, if you get them cheap and quick, okay, that's what we're going to do. If you need quality, it might take some time, and the quality will come out in those 3-inch ordnance rifles later on. Okay, so where are we getting all these cannons from? Let's talk about the industrial base. Where are the cannons coming from? In October of 1861, the War Department sent a letter or a telegram to the Ames Manufacturing Company. It said, basically, turn out light 12-pounders as rapidly as possible. Just push them out. We need them. Those are the Napoleons, okay? So we're gearing up the industrial base to crank out cannons. So Napoleons cost $680. That's a lot of money, right? $680 for a Napoleon. During the Civil War, this is from the official records, okay? 1,150 Napoleons are manufactured in the United States. Now, compared to World War II, that's like, what, a drop in the bucket. But in the Civil War, that is all the Napoleons we need. Let's put it that way. And that's where we're making them. We're making them at a number of different factories, many of them in the Northeast, many of them in New England, and one ironworks in Cincinnati, Ohio. So that's where our Napoleons are coming from. 3-inch ordnance rifles, $350. We made 1,000 of those things at one factory, one place. And that's the Phoenix Iron Company outside of Philadelphia. So that's where those came from. And the cheap, fast 10-pound Parrott, only $190 a copy, is made at the West Point Foundry by Robert Parrott. He is the guy that makes those things. So that's where we're making those guns, and that's the foundation of the artillery industrial base here. So by the end of the Civil War, the United States has purchased almost 5,000 cannons. That's besides these Napoleons and 10-pounders and 3-inch ordnance rifles. They've issued 3,400, and they got in the warehouses 1,756 cannons left. Okay. Ammunition, we want 400 rounds per gun. Is that achieved? I'm not sure, because I could not find a report on the basic load of artillery during April. But I know at Antietam, Henry Hunt has scaled that down to about 270 rounds per gun. But they made artillery ammunition in all sorts of places. And a lot of the unsung heroes are the women that manned these factories and made these artillery. It's a dangerous job. Some of these factories blew up. Some people were killed there. We purchased nearly 4 million cannonballs. I can't break them out any more than that. That's as far as the OR would tell me. But that's another of his recommendations. We want a lot of ammunition for these cannons, right? We want an artillery reserve. We're going to issue cannons to batteries, to divisions, but I want 100 guns in the artillery reserve. And the artillery reserve is really an artillery division. He will have, by the beginning of the Peninsula Campaign, 18 batteries, 94 guns. He makes it. There's staff and logistics elements. So unlike the rest of the artillery in the U.S. Army, There is a dedicated staff, administrative and logistic element to support the artillery. You go out to those infantry divisions that got 4 batteries, they don't have a logistics capability to support artillery. It's mixed in with the infantry, okay? And that's something that'll have to be changed as the war goes on. They have their own ammunition train. As batteries are used up in battle, the idea is that you can bring a battery that's shot up pretty bad and get one out of the artillery reserve. You can get ammunition out of the artillery reserve. And the artillery reserve is really designed to do what? Mass the guns. Mass the guns at a particular place on the battlefield to achieve artillery superiority. So we're going to build an artillery reserve of 100 guns. We do pretty well. We get just about there. Henry Hunt is appointed as the chief of the artillery reserve. When Berry moves up to take chief of artillery for the whole army, Henry Hunt takes over as the chief of the artillery reserve. Probably the best man to do it. Because unlike Berry, to a greater degree, Hunt's more of a tactical, he understands the tactical employment of artillery, and we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. The other thing is we want some flying artillery. What's flying artillery? Flying artillery is every cannonier's got a horse, okay? In field artillery or mounted artillery, there's horses for the guns, there's horses for the caissons, there's horses for the officers, the NCOs, but the cannoneers march along with it. And if nobody's watching, they'll jump on a limber, but that's a no-no. You don't want to wear out your horses. So by the time of April of '62, there are 4 artillery batteries that are flying artillery. And they are equipped with the 3-inch ordnance rifle, which is a significantly lighter weight gun than Napoleon. 1,800 pounds versus 2,400 pounds. The horses appreciated that, I'm sure. Just to compare the number of horses in a field artillery versus a flying artillery, Battery A, 2nd Artillery, which John Tidball had, before it was up-gunned or up-horsed, if you want to call it, and it was just a regular field artillery unit, they had 102 horses. But when they made it a flying artillery, it jumped to 189 horses. And each horse needs 26 pounds of food a day. Okay, I always like to go through that when I'm talking to folks. So Tidball's battery in August of '61 only needed 2,700 pounds of food a day. By April of '62, he needs nearly 5,000 pounds of food a day. That's one battery. That's one battery, okay? William Hayes, we met him already, didn't we? He was in Mexico with Henry Hunt. He is probably the most experienced artillery officer in the Army at the beginning of the war. Experienced, by that I mean that he's been in combat more than anybody else, okay? He is from Virginia. He will go to West Point, and he will fight well in Mexico. He will serve on the frontier in the 1850s. When the Civil War starts, he has to decide where he's going, because his father has moved to Tennessee. He's the Attorney General of Tennessee. So am I going to stay with my family in the South, or am I going to stick with the country? And he decides to stay with the country. So a lot of hard feelings in the Hayes family as the war went on and towards the end of the war, but a very, very capable officer. Horses, let's get back to horses a minute, because I think understanding horses is really important. How many artillery batteries do we have in 1859, 1860? We had 7 batteries. And let's just say we need 200 horses per battery. That's really probably too many. So we only need 1,400 horses to outfit the U.S. Army before the Civil War. Now we got hundreds of batteries, and we still need the same number of horses per battery than you did before that. And by the end of the Civil War, there's 184,000 artillery horses in the U.S. Army. And they were worn out pretty quick. 48 of those that died are what we call casualties. 48% caught something, died of disease. 30% just were worn out, exhaustion, and 22% were killed in combat. Okay, a life expectancy of a horse once he signed up. Well, he didn't have a choice, did he, in signing up, right? Once he joined the Army, is 7.5 months. That's how long a horse could expect to live in the Civil War. There's a guy named Jacob Romer who commanded an artillery battery for much of the war. He said, I went through 400 horses during the Civil War, and that's one battery. That's amazing. So horses are crucial to the mobility of artillery. It's part of the weapon system, which is artillery, isn't it? The pre-U.S. Army only has 7 or 8 batteries, very small number of horses needed, no experience in rapidly mobilizing and getting enough horses for everybody, okay? There's no existing remount or depot system to build upon, and nobody flat understood the whole art and science of recruiting, training, and fielding horses. If anybody's interested, I found an excellent article on this that I'll share later on if anybody wants more information. A great story on how the logistics of horses in the Civil War is a great story. All right, the other thing is he wants a siege train. We're going down the peninsula, right? And so initially we want a siege train of about 50 guns. By the time they get to the peninsula, the 1st Connecticut Artillery, regiment of gunners from the state of Connecticut, will have 48 guns, but there'll be about 60 more guns kind of in the pipeline as well. And I'm not going to list all those particular guns there, but I will introduce you to the commander, a guy named Robert Tyler. Robert Tyler is another West Pointer. He's from New York State like William Berry was. He served in the 3rd Artillery out on the West Coast before he came east, and he's going to serve in many different artillery capacities throughout the Civil War. But at the beginning of the Peninsula Campaign, he's with the Siege Artillery. At Gettysburg, he commands the Artillery Reserve. Okay, the last recommendation, and this one didn't fly with George McClellan. Regular Army captains will command the divisional artillery. McClellan says no. Divisional chiefs of artillery are responsible only for administrative duties, such as inspecting, supplying, and equipping. The infantry division commanders command the artillery in combat. Okay, that's not the best flow. I'll leave it at that, okay? So that is rejected. Also, no separate logistics or administrative entity is there to support the artillery. They got to get in line with the infantry guys for their ammunition and their supplies and everything else. So that's something that will not appear as an issue until what? Until we go to combat a few times and we see how things work and see how things don't work. Other problems that are out there. One is that the War Department does not want artillery regiments from the states. They only want artillery batteries. So what's an artillery regiment bring you? It brings you a colonel, a lieutenant colonel, and 2 majors. And the War Department says, we don't need all those extra field grade officers, okay? We'll take your batteries and your captains, but we don't think we need senior ranking artillery officers, okay? A lot of good artillery officers are going to hit the ceiling at captain then, aren't they? They can't go any higher in the artillery establishment unless they find a job someplace else, like an infantry brigade or a cavalry command or a staff job. So guys like John Gibbon, Commander Battery B out in Utah, Charles Griffin, West Point Battery, and John Reynolds, who was a 3rd Artillery Battery commander, will do what? They'll jump to the infantry. So you lose that expertise because of the policy that the War Department has at the time. Okay, this is what the Army looks like in April of '62 as it goes to the peninsula. William Berry is the Chief of Artillery. There are 5 infantry corps, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th. There are 72 batteries, of which 25 are regulars. You see the mix of different kinds of artillery here, mostly Napoleons, ordnance rifles, and Parrots, and then 50 other guns. These are the guns of position, like 20-pound Parrots, some siege guns, and things like that. You have Henry Hunt and William Hayes in the Artillery Reserve. The cavalry's there, and then you have your siege artillery. So this is what it looks like when we kick it off in April of '62. But almost immediately, the War Department, the President, changed things up. Because there's a guy named Stonewall Jackson who suddenly appears on the scene and starts to move up the Shenandoah Valley towards Washington, D.C., okay? So what will happen is the War Department they're already going to keep the Department of Shenandoah back to protect the Washington area, but they take the First Corps away from George McClellan. So instead of the number you saw a minute ago, 72 batteries, 392 guns, McClellan goes to the peninsula with 49 batteries and 266 guns. Now, some of that will be mediated as the month goes on, but you can see that the Army of the Potomac has a significant reduction in artillery as the Peninsula campaign starts. So that's what he's got. That's what Barry's got to work with, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th Corps. Most of these guys are West Pointers. Most of these chiefs of artillery are West Pointers, except for Robert West, who commands the 1st Pennsylvania Light Artillery Regiment. So he's an exception to the rule. So there's a summer of battles. We know them. You all know them. The 7 days, 2nd Manassas, okay? And during that time, in the bloody battles around Richmond, the Army of the Potomac loses 22 guns and a further 21 guns at 2nd Manassas, and a large number of battery commanders are killed. We're cutting our teeth. We're learning how this works, aren't we? We're also supplying the Confederate Army with artillery, okay? Those 3-inch ordnance rifles that they can't make because they don't have the technology, guess by Antietam where they are. They're with Robert E. Lee at Antietam, okay? It's a summer of battles. And at the end of the summer, William Barry submits a request to be transferred. Now, we're not sure all about what's going on here. Barry has proved to be a very good administrator, very good organizer, okay? But perhaps he was just exhausted. It's hard to say. Note what it says. At his own request, William Barry is relieved from duty. McClellan mentions or acknowledges especially his valuable service in connection with the organization of the artillery. Does he say in conducting the artillery battles of the summer of '62? He doesn't mention that, does he? Okay. So I think that's a little interesting. So Barry departs the scene from the Eastern Theater. He's going to be replaced by Henry Hunt. Henry Hunt is a West Pointer, born in Detroit, Michigan. His father was an Army officer, a lieutenant. He'll die very early in his life. He will go and live with family members in Ohio. He'll enter West Point. He'll become commissioned and go into 2nd Artillery. We know a lot of his story already. I told you he is in Mexico fighting as an artilleryman. He writes the book. He gets the 1st Napoleon Battery, does very well at 1st Bull Run, and McClellan loves the guy. McClellan thinks he's great, and I think he's great too. So this is Henry Hunt coming on the scene, and we're not done with William Barry, though, okay? William Barry is going to go back to Washington from August of '62 until February of '64 as the inspector of artillery. So we ostensibly almost have a chief of artillery in Washington. Although he doesn't have a lot of authority, he has some ability to provide guidance and influence. He sits on a number of boards as they're coming up with new ideas for things. But in February of '64, he is assigned to William Tecumseh Sherman's command, okay? William Tecumseh Sherman, I would guess, you would probably agree with me, is a hard guy to please. Wouldn't you agree with that? Okay. But he is going to do and implement the same reforms that Henry Hunt is doing in parallel on the East Coast. Barry's doing them in the Western Theater. He's going to implement the Corps Artillery Brigade when he gets there in '64. Now, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but bear with me. He's been in Washington when Henry Hunt has been working on the design of that artillery brigade, so he carries the idea out west. He's going to organize artillery brigades out there. By now, the Army is very experienced. We don't need 3 guns per 1,000 men. He's going to reduce the number of guns needed to 2 guns per 1,000. In the West, they got 12 different kinds of guns in those batteries, different calibers. Remember, think about the challenge of ammunition supply when you got all those different kind of guns. He's going to reduce it from 12 to 4. He's going to establish an artillery reserve, and he's going to shoot for that basic load of 400 guns again. What's Sherman say about William Barry? My own personal staff has been small but select. Brigadier General W.F. Barry, an officer of enlarged capacity and great experience, has filled the office of Chief of Artillery to perfection. Okay, those are pretty strong words from William Sherman. He doesn't compliment too many people. Okay, so I think that's an important thing to remember. Barry is no longer on the scene here in the East, but he is still doing good stuff for the artillery out west. What's Hunt doing? Hunt's now thrown this hot potato right after 2nd Manassas. The Army needs to restructure or reorganize in 9 days. He takes command 9 days before Antietam, and he has to first of all find out where all the batteries are. Nobody really knows where all these batteries are. They're scattered all over the place. So he's running around Virginia and Maryland writing down, and I have a copy of his from the National Archives, these pieces of paper where he's writing down where all these batteries were. He is going to send the unserviceable batteries that have been beat up in the peninsula and 2nd Manassas back to Washington. He's going to get 300 wagons of ammunition brought in. This is all in 9 days. He's got to replace horses. Where does he go and get them? Baggage trains. He's going to get volunteers to man the depleted batteries, and he's going to pretty much gut the Army Artillery Reserve. Remember how many guns we had on the peninsula? Nearly 100 guns. We only have 37 guns on the Artillery Reserve at Antietam. It's a necessary thing to do to get these artillery batteries up to shape. And he says in his report, considering the condition of which the campaign in August had left it, the Army's long arm was respectively provided. Okay. So this is 7 days. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but in the 7 days what you had is nearly all West Pointers in command of these artillery commands. Okay? You're back up to about 58 batteries and 342 guns. Note the artillery reserve. 5 brigades, 18 batteries, 96 guns. But Antietam, we're down to 7 batteries in the artillery reserve. So what do we have to do? We had to provide for the newly arrived 9th Corps, okay? The 12th Corps, the 1st Corps have to have artillery assigned, the 6th Corps. So the number of guns is in the artillery reserve goes way down. The number of 10-pound Parrots, we're not building 10-pound Parrots anymore, okay? We now have 87 3-inch ordnance rifles, so we're replacing those 10-pound Parrots out there. That was an important thing that had to be done as well. So that's Antietam. I'm not going to cover the battle. That's another talk someday. But what is going to happen after Antietam is finally Hunt gets a little break. He's going to see Fredericksburg in a couple months, but he has a little break. And he has a colleague, a guy named Charles Wainwright, who is Chief of Artillery for the 1st Corps. And Wainwright's got an excellent biography, actually a diary that he wrote that is worth your attention if you like artillery. And Wainwright's been thinking about some of the problems we have with dispersing the guns. You know, they're all out in these divisions, infantry divisions. There's no centralized command. And he suggests to Hunt, a week after Antietam, we ought to consolidate these batteries into a corps-level command. In other words, don't put them in the divisions, put them in a corps-level command. And initially, Hunt isn't real sure if that's the best thing to do. He's not convinced that that should be the way we go. But to show you on a slide what this looks like, here's dispersal. Those are infantry divisions. See how the guns are scattered out among the infantry divisions on this piece of the slide here? What Wainwright and eventually Hunt will believe is a better way to go is concentration. Where'd all the guns go? The guns are now in an independent artillery brigade, and we add a staff, a logistics and administration staff. Because, as I like to tell people, based on the fact I was in the logistics in the Army, colonels understand operations, generals understand logistics. Okay, if I may offer that to you. It's free. It's free. Okay, so that's the concentration plan, okay? And so we're trying to get Joe Hooker, who's now in command, I'm not even going to talk about Fredericksburg, to buy this, okay? Now, Hooker and Hunt don't get along. I mean, they're both Type A personalities, and they both have this rough exterior to them, and Hunt is trying to pitch the this combined plan, not getting any traction from him, okay? He's a complete convert to the plan, according to Charles Wainwright, and has urged it on Hooker, but without success. They just don't get along, okay? He says, we're not going to do this, not no, but hell no. And in fact, when the Battle of Chancellorsville comes, Hunt, you're not even going to stay in Army headquarters. I'm going to send you down to Banks Ford, kind of exile you away from the Army, during this battle. We all know how important the Battle of Chancellorsville is, right? So, Battle of Chancellorsville. What's not working for the U.S. Army artillery at Chancellorsville? First of all, Hunt's not around. Hunt's been exiled to Banks Ford, where he manages some of the reserve artillery. Artillery authority is scattered among division commanders and corps commanders. There's too many guns that didn't even get to the battle. They left them at Falmouth. That was in the rear area, okay? So we don't have all our guns. Hooker places infantry staff officers in charge of the reserve artillery train. Now, what do infantry officers know about reserve artillery, much less artillery logistics, okay? And he kept the train too far back to allow fast supply of the guns, okay? So Wainwright, who is hanging around, and remember Wainwright, I'd emphasize this, Wainwright used to be Hooker's chief of artillery. They get along. They understand each other, okay? And so Wainwright pops in on Hooker at his headquarters on May 3rd, 1863, when everything's falling apart, okay? Everything's going to hell. And here's this amazing conversation these two guys have. Wainwright wrote it down after he had the meeting with Hooker. He wrote it down verbatim. And so Wainwright shows up at Hooker's tent, and Hooker says, well, Wainwright, how's the artillery getting on? You can imagine that Wainwright's going to let him know, right? He's going to say, as badly as it can. So you're telling the Army commander the artillery is totally screwed up. Batteries are being ordered in every direction, blocking up the road. No one seems to know where to go. Where's General Hunt? Okay. Hooker dodges that question. Hooker says, what's the matter? And Wainwright says, well, every division commander wants his own batteries, and battery commanders will obey no one else's orders. It is just the condition I told you of, okay? Wainwright and Hooker can talk like this because they have a pretty good relationship and wanted to provide against by giving artillery officers of rank actual command so that they could order any battery. And he says, by the way, the ammunition in the artillery trains ought to be thrown in there for good measure. So what's Wainwright saying? You got to put somebody in charge of the artillery, okay? Well, we have no time to talk now. You take hold and make it right. Okay, so the next thing you know, Wainwright now has been told by Joe Hooker, you fix it, okay? And what's Wainwright say? Where's General Hunt? Okay? So again, we're going to finally get Hooker grudgingly acknowledging that he's at Banks Ford. You take his place, okay? So Wainwright's not ready to invest in this proposition quite yet. He says, I would rather you give it to Griffin or Ayres. Now, Griffin and Ayres are infantry commanders now. At the beginning of the war, they were artillery battery commanders. So, and they're regular Army guys. And Griffin taught at West Point. And Ayres has been an artillery officer forever. And Hooker says, I know nothing of them as artillery officers. I do know you and wish you to take it. And then he goes to one of his aides-de-camp, General Van Allen, will you write the order? And then he turns back to Wainwright. Well, what do you want? Wainwright says, I will do the best I can, General. I must have the power to put batteries with other divisions than their own and to fill them from any ammunition train. So he's really going to get this authority, almost carte blanche, from Joe Hooker. Well, let's see what Hooker says. Hooker says, Van Allen, write the order. Okay? Colonel Wainwright will take command of all the artillery and ammunition of this Army. No officer will give an order which may conflict with his arrangements. Will that do, Wainwright? Perfectly, sir. So, Wainwright's got command. What's one of the first things he does? He calls Hunt to come up from Banks Ford and says, I got command of the whole thing, but I think you ought to come back and take over, which will happen on May 4th. But what now happens is that, it shouldn't surprise you that within 2 weeks, Hooker approves the brigade concept. He's seen what the lack of organization means to the U.S. artillery, and within 2 weeks, he authorizes the artillery brigade concept. Now, the brigade concept is not just clumping all the batteries under a chief of artillery or brigade commander. It is adding a logistics piece. You need the logistics. You need the administration to make this operation run smoothly. So we're going to get an assistant adjutant general. We're going to get an acting inspector general. We're going to get an ordnance officer who handles the ammunition. we're going to hand at a quartermaster officer. Now, this is a guy that's detached from the quartermaster corps. We're not grabbing a lieutenant from an artillery battery. We are actually getting a real, no-kidding quartermaster officer and a real, no-kidding commissary officer. So they're going to handle the logistics aspects of it, and we're going to get a real, no-kidding medical officer. So you can see now we have an organization plus 75 wagons for transporting ordnance and other stores. So now we have perhaps what we need to proceed. Because in 6 weeks, we're meeting Robert E. Lee again, aren't we? At Gettysburg. We better hustle here, right? Get this thing organized. And these are the Artillery Corps Brigade commanders at Gettysburg, okay? Colonel Wainwright, who we've met, Captain John Hazard, he's here at Antietam commanding a Rhode Island battery, has the 2nd Corps. George Randolph with the 3rd Corps, not at Antietam because 3rd Corps wasn't here. Augustus Martin, he was here. He was with Morell's division as the chief of artillery. Charles H. Tompkins, Rhode Island guy with the 6th Corps, not here. Thomas Osborne, 11th Corps, not here. Lieutenant Edward Muhlenberg is here. Battery F, 4th U.S. Artillery. Now look at the wide variation in rank here. When you hear us talk about a brigade commander, what do you think? 1-star general, colonel. We got a lieutenant as a brigade commander. We only have one real no-kidding colonel here. And so Hunt will now bring that up. In this campaign at Gettysburg, I won't read it all, he said, I had one general officer, that's Robert Tyler in the Artillery Reserve, and 4 field officers, now those are colonels and majors, but everybody else in the 14 brigades, now you saw 7 on that slide, the other 7 are the Cavalry Corps and the Artillery Reserve. Everybody else is not enough grade, okay? A lieutenant commanding a brigade at Gettysburg of artillery, 12th Corps had Lieutenant Muhlenberg, okay? In no army would the command of the artillery of a corps be considered of less importance. So Hunt is on a roll to do what? Get the rank for these guys. So he is going to flash that up. I respectfully and urgently call the attention of the commanding general and through him to the War Department on this subject, and his response is, nope. They are going to have to live with this artillery rank structure for the rest of the war. So, in conclusion, in May of 1864, the 2 best artillery officers in the U.S. Army now commanded artillery in the 2 most important theaters. We have Berry on the left with Sherman, and we have Hunt on the right with Grant, okay? Hunt was at Appomattox, Berry was at Bennett Place, North Carolina, when the war ended, when the surrenders occurred. In 1977, some of you may have this book or read it, Edward Longacre published a book titled The Man Behind the Guns, a biography of Henry Jackson Hunt. And Hunt is generally credited with what? Being the organizational genius of the United States artillery. Hunt was a meticulous individual with a knowledge of artillery like few other men, but he had sort of this rough personality, as we saw with him dealing with Hooker. Yet, we must recognize the role played by William Berry as well during the first year of the war that laid what? The organizational foundation of the U.S. Army and his subsequent roles as Inspector of Artillery and artillery under General Sherman out west. And Berry, like Hunt, finished the war as he had at the beginning, in the field with artillery soldiers engaged in combat. Thank you very much.